Okay, folks, we are doing what probably seems like a reverse here, where we're going to talk about your endocrine system again. And I told you this would happen. We need to talk about the hormones that are specific to reproduction. So some of them you are familiar at least with their name, because I mentioned that they're, say, produced by the anterior pituitary or something like that. But we're going to get into the details of them. So the first part of this story is just a reminder of what we know about chromosomes. There is a chromosomal basis for sex. Now, I would like to give a disclaimer here. This is the description based on no mutation, no crossing over, no other strange thing happening, but a person who is, based on their chromosomes, male, has one X and one Y chromosome. If everything is functioning correctly, there is a gene on the Y chromosome, kind of like the master gene, and it activates other genes. This happens at around 38 days. So when I give a number of days here, I'm referring to days after fertilization. So we're talking about the life of the potential baby here. This causes differentiation of gonads. So the gonads are what we call the reproductive structures, the testes and the ovaries. But before that, an embryo has the capacity to make both types of structures. But at 38 days, these genes being activated because of the Y chromosome cause some differentiation, and then we get testes, and then we get germ cells, the ones that are going to go through meiosis, differentiating into sperm cells. But until that point, the embryo has the capacity to do both things. When the testicles start to descend or start to form, they release androgens. Testosterone is the main androgen that we would discuss, which masculinizes other structures. Now, it is very true that if this doesn't work correctly, other things don't happen correctly either. For example, there's a condition known as androgen insensitivity. I knew somebody who had this. And this person appeared to be female until they were in their mid-teens and regular puberty stuff didn't seem to be happening. Everything about them seemed female. They appeared female, they had female external genitalia. But when this girl who was about 15 and was wondering, like, why haven't I got my period yet, went to the doctor, they did a genetic test after they ruled out some other things and discovered that she actually had an X and a Y chromosome, but that her body wasn't responding to androgens. So she had a Y chromosome, she was making testosterone, but her body didn't respond to it, and so none of this masculinization of other structures ever happened. And so there are lots of in-betweens. I just want you to really know that. That's just one example of the multiple examples of things that can go astray and cause people to appear on the exterior as though they are one sex, but their chromosomes say otherwise. Females have two X chromosomes if things are functioning normally. But again, same thing happens here. There could be someone who has X chromosomes, only X chromosomes, but has had some sort of mutation or crossover that gives her the gene that's going to produce more androgens. So there's lots of in-between. In the absence of the master gene, those germ cells, the ones that are going to go through meiosis, become ova, which is the plural of ovum. And if a female embryo, so if an embryo that has two X chromosomes is exposed to androgens, the embryo can still be masculinized. So that means just because those are the chromosomes doesn't necessarily mean that's how things are going to turn out, because it also depends on the hormones that are present and being produced, which depends on which genes are activated. Okay? Does anyone want to ask anything there? This is a super interesting topic, and I know there's only 4 of you left that have to do de factos, but man, this is interesting, and I would encourage you, if you haven't decided yet, to maybe consider that idea. Now, we're going to take a look at the endocrine control for males first. The basic pathway is this: hypothalamus, pituitary, testes. I could even specify and say anterior pituitary. So you might want to add that onto your notes. I would write it on the smartboard. We all know how that would turn out. So this pathway where the hypothalamus is going to produce something that controls the pituitary, which produces stuff that controls the testes, really becomes active at puberty. Now, what age does puberty happen at? Well, it's not the same for everyone. It can be very young. It can be less than 10 years old, and it can be much older. And there doesn't seem to be much rhyme or reason as to predicting what age it will happen at for any given person. But I'm sure we'll figure it out one day. I'm sure we'll figure out there's like this one thing that triggers it. Anyways, once puberty begins, the hypothalamus will increase its production of gonadotropin releasing hormone. GN, gonadotropin, R, releasing H hormone. That one is on your data sheet, okay? This is really the only hypothalamus releasing hormone that's named. Even though they all have names, this is the only one whose name you are required to know about. So this hormone, which is going to travel through blood because it's a hormone, not a neurotransmitter, so it's going to travel through that portal blood system from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. It's going to act on that pituitary gland and stimulate it to release LH and FSH. Now, I named those two before because they come from the anterior pituitary. In the acronym, flat pig, they are the F and the L in flat. LH is luteinizing hormone. FSH is follicle stimulating hormone. And again, I gave you both of those names in the last section. They're on your hormone table of all the hormones that are produced, and they are on your data sheet. These two hormones stimulate the testes, but in slightly different ways. Once the testes are stimulated, among other things, testosterone is produced. And the testosterone produced there acts on tissues to complement the development of organs, right? So like I said before, testosterone is an androgen, masculinizes structures. And so even though quite a bit of that happens at birth, or before birth, I should say, you know that there are things that change during puberty. And so this would be a lot of secondary sex characteristics that would develop at this point. Now I'm going to show you a diagram that illustrates what FSH and LH do. So before I do, does anyone have questions about any of this? Okay. So what we have here is really what I just told you with some extra hormone-related details. You can see that the hypothalamus is at the top of our pathway. You know that the hypothalamus is in the brain. It's right in front of the thalamus. It's attached to the pituitary gland. We can see GnRH here being produced and stimulating the anterior pituitary. Then over here on the left, we see these two green arrows with pluses. Those are signifying that those are stimulating. So notice where FSH is going. They're both going to the testes, but FSH specifically is going to facilitate spermatogenesis. Now, Sertoli cells help there, but spermatogenesis specifically happens inside of which structure? It's a two-word name. First word starts with S. Lots of words start with S in this section. So inside the testes, there's these tubes that are called something. Anyone want to tell us their name? Yeah, you can look, yes. There you go. Seminiferous tubules. So if I were someone who wrote on smart boards, in this box right here, I would just add seminiferous tubules. This top one where FSH is going, because Sertoli cells are inside of the seminiferous tubules, and I want it to be clear that that's where they're going. The LH that's produced still stimulates the testes, but a different portion. It stimulates the Leydig cells, which are outside of the seminiferous tubules. Notice what's coming out of there. The Leydig cells are going to produce testosterone. This testosterone has a plus arrow right here. So that testosterone that's being produced by the Leydig cells is going to further support and stimulate spermatogenesis. So it has a stimulatory or positive effect there. But then there are these red arrows. The testosterone that's produced is going to have negative feedback, like we discussed in this section on hormones, on the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. The idea with negative feedback is that the presence of the product of the system, in this case testosterone, shuts off the system so that we don't have too much. Perhaps you could see how someone taking synthetic testosterone might impact their reproductive system. If you were to consume synthetic, really anything, it tells your body that you don't need to produce it yourself, and it shuts off the pathway. But the pathway to produce testosterone is also the pathway to produce sperm cells. And so having too much testosterone might limit the production of GnRH, which would in turn not only limit testosterone, but also FSH. So I want you to see that they're related. GnRH, the releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, stimulates both of these hormones. So if it gets negative feedback, both of those hormones suffer as a result. The other arrow is the arrow coming from where the seminiferous tubules are. Remember I said this top box in the testes section is the seminiferous tubules. Inhibin is being produced there, and inhibin has negative feedback on the anterior pituitary. So we have a couple of negative feedback pathways. Now for males, that's really it. That's how it works all the time. It doesn't vary really based on what part of the month we are in. This is more or less what's happening every day, all the time, from puberty until you die, okay? Same process. Now, I said from puberty until you die, maybe not quite until you die, but for quite a number of men, it's pretty close. There is something called andropause. It's not as significant or noticeable frequently as menopause, which you might have heard of before. In andropause, it's the result of this decline in testosterone production that tends to start around the age of 40. But notice I said decline, not complete stop. So decline, and it doesn't happen to everybody. The prostate often becomes larger at this age. That's something you might have heard, that men over 40 should get tested for prostate cancer. You know where the prostate is. Prostate is part of the reproductive system, produces some of the fluids that are part of semen. If the prostate becomes inflamed and enlarged, well, it's right next to a bunch of those tubes. It's going to press on the urethra, press on the vas deferens, and cause issues there. We could treat andropause, although as I did some research, it doesn't appear to be something that is treated frequently because the symptoms are so mild. Not to say that there wouldn't be symptoms, but generally, males have the capacity to continue to produce sperm cells for a really long time, much longer than women seem to have the capacity to produce more eggs because they have a finite number of them. Now, and on the surface, it looks the same. It's the same pathway. Hypothalamus, pituitary, but instead of testes, ovaries. Why? Well, they're doing the same thing. The testes are the ones producing sperm cells. Those are the gametes. The ovaries are the ones producing the eggs. Those are the gametes. So they're not identical, but they have the same type of function. So a girl would begin puberty when her hypothalamus increases her production of GnRH, same as with a male. It acts on the anterior pituitary to trigger the secretion of LH and FSH. Now when you look at the names of LH and FSH, and you consider male reproductive structures, you might wonder why they're named that way, because nothing in the male structure was called a follicle, and the word luteinizing doesn't appear to be related to anything. But once we take a look at what's happening in the female reproductive system, you'll see that those names are really quite conducive to the thing that they are doing. Now these two hormones, just like in a male, act on the ovaries. So LH and FSH both act on the testes of a male, both act on the ovaries of a female. The ovaries produce two main hormones, estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen is the main one involved with secondary sex characteristics, and that would have been on the very first slide of notes that I mentioned. But together, they trigger a reproductive cycle. So what goes on in the female reproductive system is quite a bit more complicated than what's going on in the male system because it changes depending on which part of the cycle we are in. So I'm going to show you some diagrams. Now, when I gave you the handouts of diagrams, I'm sure I put these on here because they're important and useful. But when we look at the female reproductive system, we'll see that the pathway is always the same. But what's going on changes as we go through the cycle. Now, this first part, the follicular phase, which we're looking at first, this happens at the beginning of a reproductive cycle. Now, we're going to spend quite a bit of time today and then the Monday that we come back after Christmas talking about the menstrual cycle, okay? So just for now, the follicular phase is the first half of the menstrual cycle. So it's about 2 weeks, 14 days. That's the follicular phase. If you were wondering, you start counting day 1, the first day that a girl starts having her period. That is day 1. So this phase would go from the day a girl starts having her period till about 14 days later. So take a look at this pathway. The hypothalamus produces GnRH, gonadotropin-releasing hormone. The anterior pituitary is stimulated. We got the green arrows with pluses. So FSH and LH are both produced, and they are stimulating the follicles in the ovaries. And now you might say, oh, I get why it's called follicle-stimulating hormone, because that's exactly what it's doing. It is stimulating follicles. In males, the things aren't called follicles, but it has the same function. So FSH and LH are stimulating those follicles. Now, in the beginning, FSH is a bit more important than LH, and you'll see that the levels are fairly low of both of them here. But the follicles, these are the structures that we looked at when we looked at that website that had what an actual ovary, actual testes look like. And the follicles are these tiny little structures where those immature eggs are. And so when FSH comes in and starts stimulating the follicles, they start to develop. And they produce some estrogen. Estrogen, in the beginning, is at a fairly low level. So the level is not super high. There's not a ton being produced. And in this scenario, we have negative feedback. Negative feedback on our hypothalamus, and it causes endometrial arteries to constrict. So if we look at the bottom, there's the uterus. We know where the uterus is. It has those layers, myometrium and endometrium. The endometrium is the inner lining that's vascularized, so it has lots of blood vessels. And it's causing them to constrict, so to tighten up. And that is what, or in part, what causes menstruation. Now that's the beginning of the menstrual cycle, what's going on with hormones. We will have to talk more about the menstrual cycle when we come back. So we're going to pause here.